The sound of hammer striking iron rang through the Montana wilderness like a church bell calling the faithful to prayer. But Jackson Cade wasn't praying for anything anymore, because he'd stopped believing God listened to men like him 3 years ago when the war ended, and he came home to find his family's ranch burned to ash and his younger brother's grave marked with nothing but a crude wooden cross. He worked the horseshoe with practiced precision, his massive forearms flexing as he shaped the hot metal against the anvil, sweat running down his bare chest despite the cool September morning in 1868. The mountains rose behind his rebuilt cabin like silent sentinels, their peaks already dusted with early snow that promised a harsh winter ahead. Jackson had carved out this existence alone, preferring the company of his 3 horses and the wolves that howled in the distance to any human conversation. He shoed his own horses, mended his own fences, hunted his own food, and spoke to no one for weeks at a time. The isolation suited him. It kept the nightmares at bay during the day, even if they still found him at night. He plunged the horseshoe into the water barrel, steam hissing up in an angry cloud. His shoulder-length dark hair, streaked with premature silver at 28, hung in damp strands around his bearded face. Every inch of his 6'4" frame was corded with muscle built from years of hard labor and harder living. Some men wore their scars on the outside, but Jackson's ran deeper, carved into places no one could see and no amount of solitude could heal. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning silence. Jackson's head snapped up, his body going rigid with the instincts of a man who'd spent 4 years in Confederate gray dodging Union bullets. The shot had come from the Eastern Trail, maybe 2 miles out. He listened, his hand moving automatically to the Colt revolver he kept on his workbench. Another shot followed, then a woman's scream cut short. He should ignore it. Whatever trouble found its way into these mountains wasn't his concern anymore. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when he tried to help a group of settlers 2 winters back and ended up with a knife wound in his side for his trouble. The world was cruel, and intervening only brought more pain. But the woman screamed again, and something in that sound of pure terror bypassed every wall he'd built around his heart. Jackson grabbed his rifle, shoved his feet into his boots, and was running before his mind caught up with his body. He moved through the forest like a ghost, his breathing steady, his eyes scanning for threats. The years in the war had taught him how to move silently, how to read the land, how to anticipate danger. He crested a ridge and saw the scene below. A wagon lay on its side in the trail, one wheel still spinning slowly. 2 men on horseback circled it like vultures, their faces hidden behind bandanas. A 3rd man lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. And pressed against the overturned wagon, a young woman in a torn blue dress held a small pistol with shaking hands, pointing it at the riders. "Just shoot her already, Tom," one of the riders called. "She ain't got nothing worth taking anyway." "Maybe we take her with us," the other replied with a laugh that made Jackson's jaw clench. "Pretty thing like that could fetch a price across the border." The woman fired her pistol. The shot went wide, and one of the men laughed harder. Jackson didn't announce himself. He simply raised his rifle and fired, the bullet catching the first rider in the shoulder and spinning him off his horse. The second man wheeled around, drawing his weapon, but Jackson had already worked the lever action and fired again. This shot hit the man's gun hand, sending his revolver flying into the brush. "Ride out," Jackson's voice carried across the clearing, cold and flat, "or the next one goes through your skull." The first man, clutching his bleeding shoulder, scrambled onto his horse. The second needed no more encouragement. Within seconds, both riders were galloping down the trail, leaving dust and blood in their wake. Jackson waited a full minute, making sure they weren't coming back, before he descended the slope. His rifle remained ready, his eyes never leaving the woman who still pressed herself against the wagon, her pistol now aimed at him. "Easy," he said, stopping 20 feet away. "They're gone." "Stay back." Her voice shook, but her grip on the pistol steadied. She had brown hair that had come loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders in waves. Even from this distance, he could see her eyes were a striking green, bright with unshed tears and fury. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with a face that belonged in a portrait, not on this rough mountain trail. "I'm going to put my rifle down," Jackson said slowly, suiting action to words. He laid the weapon on the ground and straightened, keeping his hands visible. "My name is Jackson Cade. I have a cabin about 2 miles west. Are you hurt?" "My father." The words came out as a sob, and her pistol lowered slightly. "They shot my father." Jackson moved to the man on the ground, kneeling beside him. He didn't need to check for a pulse to know the man was dead. The bullet had caught him square in the chest, but he did anyway, feeling for any sign of life against the cooling skin. Nothing. He looked up at the woman and shook his head slowly. The pistol fell from her hands, clattering against a rock. She made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed to her knees. Jackson stood, unsure what to do. He wasn't good at this anymore, at offering comfort or finding the right words. He'd been alone too long, had forgotten how to be gentle. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Sarah." She pressed her hands against her face. "Sarah Mitchell. We were traveling from Fort Benton to Virginia City. Father had business there. We thought this route would be faster." A bitter laugh escaped her. Faster. Jackson looked at the overturned wagon, at the scattered supplies, at the dead man who'd likely been trying to give his daughter a better life in the gold rush town. The same story played out across the West every day. Dreams turned to dust and blood on forgotten trails. "We need to bury him," he said, "before the animals come." Sarah looked up at him, her green eyes swimming with tears. I can't just leave him here in the middle of nowhere." "It's not the middle of nowhere." Jackson gestured to the mountains around them. "It's Montana. It's wild and it's hard, but it's not nowhere. And your father would want you safe more than he'd care about where his body rests." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her making calculations behind those grief-stricken eyes. She was alone in the wilderness with a stranger who looked more savage than civilized, with his bare chest and long hair and beard. She had every reason to fear him, but she also had no other choice. "Will you help me?" The question came out as a whisper. Jackson nodded once. He retrieved his rifle and set about the grim work. There were tools in the overturned wagon, and the ground was soft enough. He dug while Sarah sat with her father's body, holding his hand and speaking to him in a voice too low for Jackson to hear. He didn't intrude on her grief. He understood loss too well to violate its privacy. By the time he finished digging and they lowered her father into the ground, the sun had climbed to its zenith. Sarah spoke words over the grave, reciting the 23rd Psalm in a trembling voice. Jackson removed his hat and stood silent, feeling like an intruder even in his respectful distance. When she finished, she remained kneeling beside the fresh earth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jackson gave her time, then finally spoke. "Miss Mitchell, it's not safe for you to stay here. Those men might come back with reinforcements, and you can't reach Virginia City alone. My cabin is fortified and stocked for winter. You're welcome to shelter there until we can figure out how to get you somewhere safe." Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question. Jackson wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. "Because you need help," he said finally. "And because I'm not so far gone that I'd leave a woman alone in the wilderness." She studied him with those penetrating green eyes, and Jackson had the uncomfortable feeling she could see straight through to all his broken pieces. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Cade." "Jackson," he corrected. He moved to the wagon, writing what he could and salvaging her belongings. She didn't have much beyond clothes, some books, and a few personal items. He loaded everything into 2 packs that he could carry, along with the supplies from the wagon that would be useful. Sarah changed behind the wagon into a more practical dress for traveling, and they set out as the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees. Jackson led the way, his rifle ready, constantly scanning for danger. Sarah followed without complaint, even though he could tell her fine leather shoes weren't meant for this terrain. They reached his cabin as twilight painted the mountains purple and gold. It was a solid structure, built from logs he'd cut himself, with a stone chimney and real glass windows he'd hauled up from Fort Benton. The barn beside it housed his 3 horses, who nickered at his approach. The fences he'd mended just last week enclosed a small pasture where his vegetable garden had provided well over the summer. "It's not much," Jackson said, suddenly seeing the place through her eyes and finding it wanting. "It's wonderful," Sarah said softly, and when he looked at her, he saw she meant it. "You built all this yourself?" "Had to. It's the only way to survive up here." He led her inside, lighting the oil lamps that pushed back the gathering darkness. The interior was spare but clean, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs he'd crafted himself, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and a bed in the corner separated by a curtain for privacy. Animal furs covered the wooden floor, and his few possessions were organized with military precision. "You can have the bed," Jackson said, already planning to sleep in the barn with the horses. "I'll bring in water so you can wash, and I'll make something to eat." "Mr. Cade, Jackson." Sarah touched his arm, and he flinched instinctively at the contact. She pulled back, apology in her eyes. "I don't want to displace you from your home. I can sleep on the floor or in the barn." "You'll sleep in the bed," Jackson said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'll be fine in the barn. I've slept in worse places." He could see she wanted to protest, but exhaustion and grief were catching up with her. She simply nodded and sank into one of the chairs as if her strings had been cut. Jackson moved through the familiar routine of starting a fire in the stove, filling a basin with water from the pump outside, setting coffee to boil. He was acutely aware of her presence in his space, this woman who'd appeared in his life like a storm he hadn't seen coming. She watched him work with those observant eyes, and he wondered what she saw. Probably a half-wild mountain man who'd forgotten how to live among civilized people. He prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and cornbread, more than he usually bothered with for himself. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind beginning to pick up outside. Sarah ate mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere, probably replaying the morning's horror. "How long have you lived here?" she asked finally, her voice startling in the quiet. 3 years. Built the cabin the first year, survived by the skin of my teeth. Second year got easier. Third year, I finally felt like maybe I'd make it. "Do you ever get lonely?" The question pierced something in his chest. "No," he lied. She looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see too much. "I think you do." Jackson stood abruptly, collecting the dishes. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow I'll ride to the trading post about 15 miles south. There's a man there who makes runs to Fort Benton. We can arrange passage for you." "What if I don't want to go to Fort Benton?" Sarah asked. "What if I want to continue to Virginia City like my father planned?" "Then we'll arrange that instead. But Miss Mitchell, you should know that Virginia City is full of miners and gamblers and men who see women as commodities. If you have family elsewhere, somewhere safe, that would be better." "I have an aunt in Boston." Sarah's voice was small. "But I haven't seen her since I was 12. Father and I were all each other had after Mother died 5 years ago." Jackson understood that loneliness, that feeling of being the last one standing when everyone you loved had fallen. "Boston might be a good choice. It's safe, civilized. You could start over there." "Could I?" She looked down at her hands. "Or would I spend the rest of my life remembering this day, seeing my father fall every time I close my eyes?" "You'll remember it regardless of where you are," Jackson said quietly. "Tragedy doesn't respect geography. But at least in Boston you'd be alive and safe to do the remembering." Sarah met his gaze. "Were you in the war?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes." "Which side?" "Confederate, not because I owned slaves or believed in their cause, but because everyone I knew was going, and I was young and stupid and thought war was about glory." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. He didn't talk about the war. Ever. "What happened to change your mind?" 4 years of killing and watching friends die and coming home to find everything I loved burned to ash." He regretted the words immediately. This wasn't her burden to carry. "I'm sorry. That's not appropriate conversation." "Why not? Because I'm a woman and supposedly too delicate for truth?" Sarah's voice held an edge. "My father was shot in front of me this morning, Mr. Cade. I think I can handle knowing that war is horrible." Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, and saw steel beneath the grief. Sarah Mitchell wasn't some fragile flower that would wilt at the first hardship. She'd already proven that by holding off those men with her small pistol, by maintaining her composure even now. "You're right," he said. "I apologize for underestimating you." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the wall of shock and sorrow. "Thank you. For today, for tonight, for treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved." "You're not a problem." The words came out rougher than he intended. "You're someone who needs help, and I'm someone who can provide it. That's all." But even as he said it, Jackson knew it wasn't all. There was something about Sarah Mitchell that unsettled him, that made him aware of how empty his cabin had felt before she arrived, how silent his days had been. She represented everything he'd walked away from: human connection, vulnerability, the risk of caring about someone who could be taken away. He showed her where the wash basin was, gave her privacy to clean up, then grabbed his bedroll and headed for the barn. The horses greeted him with soft sounds, and he settled into the hay beside them, staring up at the roof beams and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of gunfire and screaming and green eyes that saw past all his defenses. Morning arrived with frost on the ground, and Sarah, standing in the doorway of his barn, wrapped in a shawl and looking uncertain. Jackson sat up from his bedroll, suddenly conscious of his disheveled state. "I made coffee," she said. "I hope that's all right. I didn't know if you'd want me using your things, but I thought after yesterday we could both use something warm." Jackson stood, brushing hay from his hair. "That's fine, thank you." They walked back to the cabin together, the morning air sharp and clean. Inside, the fire was already going, and the scent of coffee filled the space. Sarah had tidied up, and he noticed she'd found his spare blanket and folded it neatly on the chair. She'd put her hair up in a simple bun, and in the morning light, he could see the exhaustion written on her face, despite what must have been a long night. "Did you sleep?" he asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Some. I kept thinking I heard Father's voice, calling for me." She wrapped her hands around the cup he offered. "Is that normal?" "Yes." Jackson leaned against the counter, maintaining distance. "After the war, I heard my brother's voice for months. Sometimes I still do." "What happened to him?" "Died while I was away. Raiders came through, burned the ranch. He tried to fight them off." Jackson stared into his coffee. "He was 16. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's voice was soft with genuine sympathy. "You've lost so much." "Everyone has. That's the way of things out here." He set down his cup. "I'm going to ride to the trading post today. Should be back by nightfall. You'll be safe here if you keep the door barred, and my spare rifle is loaded over the mantel." "I could come with you?" "Better if you stay. Those men from yesterday might be looking for you." Jackson moved to the door, then paused. "Sarah, I need you to promise me you won't open this door for anyone but me. I don't care what they say or how friendly they seem. Trust no one." She nodded solemnly. "I promise." He saddled his best horse, a roan mare named Whiskey who had good endurance, and set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The ride to the trading post took him through some of the most beautiful country he'd ever seen: forests thick with pine and aspen, meadows where elk grazed in the morning mist, streams so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately, but sometimes he forgot how stunning it was. The trading post was run by a grizzled old-timer named Dutch Ferguson, who'd made his fortune in furs and now served as the unofficial hub of commerce for the scattered settlers in these mountains. Dutch looked up from oiling a trap when Jackson walked in, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Jackson Cade, as I live and breathe. Thought maybe you'd died up in those mountains and the wolves had eaten you." "Not yet." Jackson approached the counter. "I need information. 2 men attacked a wagon on the Eastern Trail yesterday. One I shot in the shoulder, the other in the hand. They were trying to rob and possibly kidnap a woman. You hear anything about that?" Dutch's expression turned serious. "There's been a gang operating out of the territories, hitting wagons headed to Virginia City. 4 or 5 men, led by a fellow named Tom Briggs. Mean as a snake and twice as quick. You said you shot 2 of them?" "Sent them running. They'll want revenge for that. Briggs doesn't like anyone interfering with his business." Dutch studied Jackson with shrewd eyes. "What happened to the woman?" "She's at my cabin. Her father was killed in the attack. I need to arrange passage for her to Fort Benton, or possibly all the way back east. That's going to take some time. Winter's coming fast and the wagon routes are already getting dicey. Might be a week or more before I can find someone trustworthy to take her." Dutch leaned forward. "She pretty?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant." Dutch's grin was knowing. "She must be real pretty for you to break 3 years of solitude. Be careful, son. You've been alone so long you might have forgotten that people can hurt you worse than any bullet." "I haven't forgotten anything." Jackson purchased some supplies, ammunition, and a few items he thought Sarah might need, including a proper coat for the dropping temperatures. He also bought fabric, needles, and thread, thinking she might want to occupy her hands while she waited. The ride back took longer than expected. He had to detour around a section of trail that had washed out in recent rains, and by the time he approached his cabin, the sun was already setting. Something felt wrong. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he slowed Whiskey to a walk, his hand moving to his rifle. The cabin looked undisturbed from the outside, but his fences, the ones he'd just mended last week, had been cut. 3 posts were down, and his 2 other horses were missing from the pasture. Jackson dismounted silently, tying Whiskey to a tree well away from the cabin, and approached on foot. He heard voices before he reached the door, men's voices, and Sarah's raised in anger. "I told you I don't know where he went. He said he'd be back by nightfall, and that's all." "Well, your mountain man friend cost us a lot of trouble yesterday." This voice was hard, cruel. "Tom's shoulder's torn up bad, and Jake can't hold a gun anymore, so we figured we'd wait here and have a little chat with him when he gets back, and maybe have some fun with you while we wait." Jackson moved to the window, peering in carefully. 3 men were inside his cabin. Sarah was backed against the far wall, her face pale, but her chin lifted defiantly. One man was pointing a gun at her casually, another was rifling through Jackson's belongings, and the third, clearly the leader with his cold eyes and cruel mouth, sat in Jackson's chair like he owned the place. "You know, you're even prettier than Tom said. Shame you have to be involved in this, but business is business." Jackson's mind raced, calculating angles and odds. 3 against 1, and they were inside with Sarah as a potential hostage. He couldn't just burst in shooting, too much risk of hitting her. He needed to be smart about this. He circled to the back of the cabin, where there was a small window he kept cracked for ventilation. It was big enough for him to hear everything being said. "Please," Sarah was saying, her voice steady despite the fear he could hear underneath. "I have money. My father had a small fortune sewn into his coat. I can tell you where it's hidden if you just leave us alone." "Now that's interesting." The leader stood, walking toward her. "But see, even if you give us the money, we still have to deal with your friend. Can't have him coming after us. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to write him a note saying you left, got scared, found another way to Fort Benton. Then we're going to wait outside and put a bullet in him when he comes home. After that, you're coming with us. Pretty thing like you will fetch a good price." "No." Sarah's voice rang with conviction. "I won't do it." The slap echoed through the cabin, and Jackson's vision went red. He moved to the front door, his body flowing into the combat readiness that had kept him alive through the war. He didn't announce himself. He simply kicked the door open with enough force to splinter the frame and stepped inside with his rifle raised. The man who'd been pointing a gun at Sarah spun toward the door, but Jackson was faster. He shot him in the chest before the man could get a shot off. The second man reached for his weapon, and Jackson worked the lever and fired again, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him into the wall. The leader, Briggs, was quick. He grabbed Sarah and pulled her in front of him as a shield, his gun pressed to her head. "Drop it!" Briggs snarled. "Drop the rifle or I paint the walls with her brains." Jackson froze, his rifle still aimed, his mind calculating trajectories and risks. He could make the shot, probably, but probably wasn't good enough when Sarah's life hung in the balance. "I said drop it!" Briggs pressed the gun harder against Sarah's temple, and she whimpered. Jackson slowly lowered the rifle, setting it on the ground. "Let her go. Your fight is with me, not her. My fight is with anyone who costs me money and hurts my men." Briggs's eyes were flat, dead. "You should have minded your own business." "Jackson, don't!" Sarah's voice was steady despite the gun at her head. "He's going to kill us both anyway." "Smart girl." Briggs's finger tightened on the trigger. Jackson moved. Years of training and instinct took over, his body flowing forward in a motion too fast for the eye to track. He grabbed Briggs's gun hand and twisted viciously, hearing bones crack. Briggs screamed and the gun clattered to the floor. Jackson didn't stop. He drove his fist into the man's face once, twice, feeling cartilage crunch under his knuckles. Sarah scrambled away, and Jackson dragged Briggs outside, his rage finally finding an outlet. He threw the man into the dirt, then stood over him, breathing hard. "You have 2 choices," Jackson said, his voice deadly calm. "You can die right here, right now, or you can take your men and ride out and never come back. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you. If I hear about you hurting anyone else, I'll hunt you down and kill you. Do you understand?" Briggs spat blood, his face already swelling. "You're a dead man, you hear me? Dead?" Jackson pulled his Colt revolver and aimed it at Briggs's head. "Wrong answer." "Wait!" Briggs held up his hands. "Wait, we'll go. We'll leave. You'll never see us again." "Get your men and get out. You have 60 seconds before I start shooting." Briggs scrambled up, half dragging his wounded companions toward their horses. The man Jackson had shot in the chest was dead, but the other was conscious enough to ride. Jackson watched them mount up and disappear down the trail before he holstered his weapon and turned back to the cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand pressed against the red mark on her face where Briggs had struck her. When she saw Jackson, something in her expression broke, and she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and holding on like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. Jackson stood rigid, his arms at his sides, completely unprepared for this. He didn't know what to do with this woman clinging to him, with the feeling of her body pressed against his, with the scent of her hair and the sound of her quiet sobs against his chest. Slowly, carefully, as if handling something infinitely fragile, he lifted his arms and wrapped them around her. She felt small in his embrace, despite her height, breakable, human, real. "You're safe," he heard himself say. "I've got you. You're safe." They stood like that for a long time, the stars coming out overhead, the mountain wind sighing through the pines. Finally, Sarah pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall apart on you." "You didn't fall apart. You survived." Jackson studied her face, the bruise already forming on her cheek. Something dark and protective stirred in his chest. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "No. They were mostly just threatening, waiting for you." She looked back at the cabin. "There's a body in there." "I'll deal with it. You go inside, bar the door, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." He dragged the dead man into the woods, far enough that the animals would take care of the remains before they became a problem. It was ugly work, but necessary. When he returned to the cabin, he found Sarah had cleaned up the blood and was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I've never seen anyone die before yesterday," she said without looking up. "Now I've seen 2 men killed in as many days." Jackson washed his hands in the basin, the water turning pink. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "Are you sorry you killed them?" "No." He dried his hands and turned to face her. "They would have killed us both without a second thought. Some men can be reasoned with, some can't. Learning the difference keeps you alive." Sarah finally looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You're not what I expected when you first appeared on that trail yesterday." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone harder, colder, someone who'd help out of obligation or duty but not really care." She stood, moving closer to him. "But you do care. I can see it, even though you try to hide it." "Sarah." He wanted to step back but found himself rooted in place. "You should get some rest. It's been a long day." "Will you tell me about him? Your brother?" The question surprised him. No one had asked about Daniel in 3 years. "Why?" "Because you've been carrying him alone for too long. And because talking about the people we love keeps them alive in a way that silence doesn't." Jackson found himself speaking before he could stop the words. His name was Daniel. He was funny, always making jokes even when things were hard. He wanted to be a teacher, loved reading more than anything. When I left for the war, he begged me to take him along, but he was too young. I made him promise to take care of the ranch, to keep it safe until I got back. His voice roughened. He kept his promise the only way he could. He died defending it. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "I'm sure he knew you loved him. I'm sure he never blamed you for leaving. I blame me enough for both of us." Jackson looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her smooth skin and his scarred knuckles. "I spent 3 years up here punishing myself for surviving when he didn't, for not being there when it mattered." "Jackson." Sarah moved even closer, her free hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. "You can't live your life as a punishment. That's not honoring your brother's memory. That's just wasting the life he died protecting." Her touch burned like fire, like something he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Jackson pulled away gently, the loss of contact almost painful. "You should sleep in the cabin tonight. I'll keep watch in case Briggs decides to come back." He saw the hurt in her eyes at his withdrawal, but she nodded. "At least come inside. You can keep watch from here where it's warm." They settled into an awkward truce, Sarah in the bed behind the curtain and Jackson in a chair by the door, his rifle across his lap. He listened to her breathing eventually slow and deepen into sleep while he watched the darkness outside and fought the war raging inside himself. He'd spent 3 years building walls, creating a life where he didn't have to feel anything beyond basic survival, and Sarah Mitchell had walked into that life and started dismantling those walls brick by brick without even trying. She saw him, really saw him, past the beard and the muscles and the isolation to the broken man underneath. And God help him, part of him wanted to be seen, part of him was tired of being alone, but letting her in meant risking everything. It meant being vulnerable again, caring again, having something to lose again. Jackson didn't know if he was strong enough to survive losing someone else he loved. The night passed slowly, measured in the quiet sounds of an owl hunting, wind in the trees, the distant howl of wolves. When dawn finally broke, Jackson had made no decisions beyond getting through the next day. Sarah emerged from behind the curtain with her hair down, wearing a simple dress, and Jackson's breath caught in his throat. In the soft morning light, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the strength and kindness that shone through her. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, studying his face with concern. "Enough." He stood, his body stiff from sitting all night. "I need to check the fences those men cut and see if I can find my other horses." "I'll make breakfast." They worked in companionable silence, and Jackson found himself hyper-aware of her presence in his space. The way she moved around his kitchen like she belonged there, the soft humming under her breath as she cooked, the smile she gave him when she handed him a plate of eggs and bacon. After breakfast, he went out to assess the damage. The fence posts could be mended, but it would take most of the day. He just started work when Sarah appeared with tools from his barn. "Show me what to do," she said simply. "4 hands work faster than 2. "It's hard work. You'll ruin your dress." "I have others, and I'd rather be useful than sit in the cabin remembering yesterday." So Jackson taught her how to mend fences, how to dig out the broken posts and set new ones, how to stretch the wire tight and secure it properly. She worked without complaint, even when her hands blistered and her back clearly ached. He found himself telling her stories as they worked, about building the cabin, about the wildlife that visited, about the harsh but beautiful winters. "Why did you come here?" Sarah asked during a break, wiping sweat from her forehead. "To Montana specifically?" "It was far away from everything I'd lost, far away from people who wanted to talk about the war or offer sympathy that felt like salt in wounds. Here I could just exist without explaining myself to anyone." "And has it helped? The isolation?" Jackson considered the question as he looked around at the land he'd carved out through sheer will and stubbornness. "It's kept me alive, but I'm not sure that's the same as living." Sarah met his gaze across the fence line. "No, it's not." They worked until the sun started its descent, then returned to the cabin tired and satisfied. Jackson found his horses grazing in a meadow a mile south, spooked but unharmed. The rhythm of the day felt natural in a way his solitary routine never had. Having someone to share meals with, to talk to work alongside, it eased something in his chest he hadn't realized was tight. Over the following days, they fell into a pattern. Jackson would work on the various tasks required to prepare for winter, cutting and stacking firewood, hunting and smoking meat, checking his trap lines. Sarah helped where she could and spent her time reading from the books she'd salvaged from the wagon or sewing, creating a new dress from fabric Jackson had bought at the trading post. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, really talk, about their lives and dreams and losses. Jackson learned that Sarah had been a teacher in a small town in Missouri before her father decided to try his luck in the Virginia City gold fields. She'd been excited about the adventure, about seeing the West she'd only read about in books. She loved poetry and could recite Whitman from memory. She'd always wanted to travel, to see the ocean, to experience life beyond the small confines of the town where she'd grown up. Sarah learned that Jackson had planned to be a rancher before the war, that he'd loved working with horses, and had dreamed of building something lasting. He admitted that his isolation wasn't entirely self-imposed, that he'd tried to rejoin society after the war but found himself unable to cope with crowds or loud noises or people who didn't understand what he'd seen and done. The mountains had saved him in a way, giving him space to breathe and heal at his own pace. A week passed, then two. Dutch sent word via a trapper that he hadn't found safe passage to Fort Benton yet, and that Sarah should stay put until after the first snow at least. Jackson should have been anxious about the delay, about having his solitude invaded for so long. Instead, he found himself grateful for the reprieve. Something was growing between them, fragile and tentative, but undeniably real. It was in the way Sarah's face lit up when he returned from hunting, in the way Jackson found himself bringing her small gifts, a perfect pine cone, a blue jay feather, wildflowers before the frost killed them. In the comfortable silences that fell between them and the way they seemed to orbit each other in the cabin's small space, always aware of where the other stood. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Sarah touched his arm. "Jackson, your hair's getting long enough that it's falling in your eyes. Would you like me to trim it?" He should say no. Letting her touch him that intimately would be crossing a line they'd carefully avoided, but he found himself nodding and sitting in the chair she pulled out. Sarah worked slowly, carefully, her fingers gentle as she combed through his hair and cut away the split ends. Jackson closed his eyes, focusing on breathing steadily, trying to ignore the way his skin felt electrified everywhere she touched. Her hands moved to his beard, trimming it into a neater shape, and he could feel her breath soft against his face. "There," she said finally, stepping back. "Much better. You look less like a wild mountain man, and more like a gentleman who happens to live in the mountains." Jackson opened his eyes and found her standing close, so close he could count the gold flecks in her green eyes. The air between them felt charged, heavy with words neither of them dared speak. Sarah," his voice came out rough. "I need you to understand something. I'm not good at this. At being close to someone. The war broke something in me, and I don't know if it can be fixed." "What if it doesn't need to be fixed?" She reached up to cup his cheek, her palm warm against his newly trimmed beard. "What if you're not as broken as you think you are? What if you just need someone who can see past the damage to the man underneath? And if I let you in and then lose you? I can't survive that again, Sarah. I barely survived the first time. You think I'm not scared too?" Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I watched my father die, Jackson. I was attacked and nearly killed. I should be terrified of everything, including you. But instead, when I'm with you, I feel safer than I've ever felt. You make me want to be brave enough to live again, not just survive." Jackson stood slowly, his large frame dwarfing hers, but he moved with such care, such tenderness, as if she were made of spun glass. He cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he whispered, "and you deserve someone whole, someone who can give you the world, not a damaged hermit hiding in the mountains." "I don't want the world." Sarah's hands came up to cover his, holding them against her face. "I want you, just you, with all your scars and silence and strength. I want the man who saved me, who buried my father with respect, who trusted me enough to share his grief. I want the man who shoes his own horses and mends his own fences, but is finally letting me mend the broken parts of him." The last of Jackson's resistance crumbled. He lowered his head and kissed her, gentle at first, barely a brush of lips. But when she rose on her toes and pressed closer, her arms wrapping around his neck, the kiss deepened into something fierce and desperate and full of all the loneliness they'd both carried for too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be someone's partner again. How to let myself care without drowning in fear of loss. Then we'll figure it out together." Sarah smiled through her tears. One day at a time. One fence post, one horseshoe, one mended piece at a time. That night, Jackson didn't sleep in the barn or in the chair by the door. He held Sarah in his bed, both of them fully clothed, just holding each other through the darkness. It was the best night's sleep he'd had in 3 years. The next morning brought the first real snow, thick flakes that fell steady and silent, blanketing the world in white. Jackson woke to find Sarah standing at the window, wrapped in one of his shirts, watching the snow with wonder on her face. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I've never seen snow like this." Jackson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Wait until you've been snowed in for 3 months straight. You might change your mind." "Not if I'm snowed in with you." They spent the day inside, the storm too fierce for outside work. Jackson taught Sarah how to play chess with a set carved from pine, and she read poetry to him in her clear, sweet voice. They cooked together, the cabin warm and cozy with the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. In the afternoon, as they sat on the floor by the fire, Sarah asked the question Jackson had been dreading. "When the snow clears and Dutch finds passage, what happens? Do I leave for Boston and you stay here?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "What do you want to happen?" "I asked you first." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. 3 weeks ago, if you'd asked me what I wanted, I would have said to be left alone, to live out my days in peace, bothering no one and having no one bother me. But you've changed everything, Sarah. You've reminded me what it feels like to care about someone, to want to wake up and see their face, to have a reason beyond simple survival." He took a deep breath. "I want you to stay. But that's selfish of me, because you could have a good life in Boston, safety and society and everything I can't give you up here." "You're wrong." Sarah's voice was firm. "You're giving me exactly what I need. You're giving me purpose and partnership and a love that feels real and earned, not based on social expectations or convenience. Boston has nothing for me but memories of a life that doesn't fit anymore. Here, with you, I can build something new, something that's ours." "It's a hard life, Sarah. The winters are brutal. We're miles from the nearest neighbor. And if something goes wrong, we're on our own. I can't promise you comfort or ease." "I don't want ease. I want a life that matters." She squeezed his hands. "I want to be your partner, Jackson. In all things. Building this homestead, surviving the winters, creating a future, if you'll have me." Jackson pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "I'll have you. For as long as you'll put up with a stubborn mountain man who doesn't know how to express his feelings." "Lucky for you, I'm an excellent teacher." Sarah kissed him softly. "Lesson 1. When you feel something, say it out loud. Try it now. I love you." The words came easier than he expected, like something that had been waiting to be released. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see good in me that I don't see in myself. I love how you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. I love everything about you, Sarah Mitchell." Sarah's smile was radiant. "See? You're a natural. Now I'll try. I love you, Jackson Cade. I love your protective nature and your gentle hands and the way you pretend to be tougher than you are. I love how you talk to your horses and the care you take with everything you do. I love the man you are and the man you're becoming." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, talking about expanding the cabin before next winter, about getting more livestock, about whether Sarah should try to contact her aunt in Boston to let her know she was alive and well. Jackson felt something unfurling in his chest, something that had been locked away for years. Hope, the possibility of a future that held more than just survival. As the days turned into weeks and autumn faded into winter, Sarah became an integral part of Jackson's life and work. He taught her to shoot, to ride, to recognize the signs of changing weather. She proved to be a quick learner with a natural aptitude for the wilderness. Together, they hunted elk for winter meat, and Sarah helped him butcher and preserve it. She learned to cure hides and make candles from tallow. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Jackson would hold her while she read aloud, or they would simply talk about everything and nothing. He told her stories about the war he'd never shared with anyone, about the friends he'd lost and the things he'd done that haunted him. She listened without judgment, offering comfort through her presence and understanding. Sarah shared her own griefs and fears, the loneliness she'd felt after her mother died, the pressure of being her father's sole support and companion, the guilt she carried over his death, even though she knew rationally it wasn't her fault. Jackson helped her work through that guilt, reminding her that her father had chosen to take the risk, that he'd wanted to give her a better life, that he would want her to live fully and find happiness. A month after the first snow, on a clear, cold morning, Jackson rode to the trading post. He spent his carefully hoarded savings on a simple gold band, then rode back home through the winter landscape, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jackson did something he'd never done before. He got down on one knee. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "I'm not good with words, and I don't have much to offer except a hard life in a beautiful place. But Sarah Mitchell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you and learning how to be the man you see when you look at me?" "Yes." The word came out as a sob, and she was in his arms before he could stand, kissing him through her tears. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They held each other in the firelight, and Jackson felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally begin to heal. They decided to wait until spring to marry properly, wanting Dutch Ferguson to serve as witness and perhaps a few of the scattered neighbors to attend. But in Jackson's mind, Sarah was already his wife in every way that mattered. They shared his bed, they shared his life, and he couldn't imagine a future without her in it. The winter settled in hard, with snowdrifts that reached the cabin windows and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the basin would freeze overnight even with the fire going. But inside their small sanctuary, Jackson and Sarah created their own warmth. They worked together on projects to pass the long, dark days. Sarah sewed new curtains from fabric Jackson had bought, making the cabin more comfortable and attractive. Jackson carved her a rocking chair, working carefully to make it smooth and sturdy. They celebrated Christmas with a small pine tree they cut from the forest and decorated with strings of popcorn and carved wooden ornaments. Jackson gave Sarah a leather-bound journal he'd purchased from Dutch before the heavy snows, knowing how much she loved to write. Sarah gave him a new shirt she'd sewn in secret, embroidered with pine trees around the collar. "It's beautiful," Jackson said, running his fingers over the careful stitches. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to. You do so much for me, Jackson. Letting me contribute in small ways makes me feel like a true partner." "You are a partner, in everything." He pulled her close. "I don't know how I survived without you." As the winter deepened, they faced challenges together. A pack of wolves came down from the high country, desperate and hungry. Jackson had to shoot 2 that got too close to the horses, and they spent a tense week keeping watch every night. A section of the cabin roof began to leak during a thaw, and they had to work together to repair it in freezing rain, both of them soaked and shivering by the time they finished. But there were beautiful moments, too. Mornings when they woke wrapped in each other's arms, the world silent and white outside. Evenings when they would stand on the porch and watch the sunset, paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Nights when they would make love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal care. Jackson found himself laughing again, something he'd thought he'd forgotten how to do. Sarah had a wry sense of humor that caught him off guard, and a way of seeing the absurdity in difficult situations. When they got snowed in for a week, solid with nothing to do but wait it out, she declared it a honeymoon practice, and made a game of finding new ways to entertain themselves without leaving the cabin. In February, during a brief warm spell, Dutch Ferguson made his way up to the cabin on snowshoes, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. "I'll be damned," he said when he saw Sarah. "You're still here. Figured you'd have gone crazy from isolation by now." "Quite the opposite," Sarah said with a smile. "I've never been happier." Dutch looked between her and Jackson, noting the way they stood close together, Sarah's hand resting comfortably on Jackson's arm. "Well, I'll be damned," he said again. "You two planning to make this official?" "In spring," Jackson confirmed. "Thought maybe you could officiate, being the closest thing to a judge in these parts." "I'd be honored," Dutch grinned. "Never thought I'd see the day Jackson Cade came down from his mountain. Guess love really does conquer all." Dutch stayed for dinner, entertaining them with stories from the trading post and news of the wider world. Before he left, he pulled Jackson aside. "She's good for you, son. I can see it in your eyes. You're not carrying death around with you anymore." "She saved me," Jackson said simply. "In every way a person can be saved." That's how love works. We save each other. Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. Take care of her and let her take care of you. That's the secret. As winter slowly released its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, crocuses pushing through the melting snow, Sarah's belly began to swell with new life. They'd suspected for a few weeks, but when she finally confirmed her pregnancy, Jackson felt a terror and joy so intense it brought him to his knees. A baby, he whispered, his large hand spread across her still flat stomach. Sarah, I don't know how to be a father. And I don't know how to be a mother. She covered his hand with hers. But we'll learn together, just like we've learned everything else. This child will be so loved, Jackson, so wanted. That's what matters most. The pregnancy galvanized Jackson into action. He began expanding the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a nursery. Sarah helped where she could, though Jackson was careful not to let her overexert herself. He hunted with new purpose, determined to have plenty of meat stored for when the baby came. He rode to the trading post more frequently, purchasing fabric for baby clothes, a cradle that Sarah cried over for its sweetness, supplies they would need. In April, as the mountain wildflowers began to bloom, they were married in a simple ceremony attended by Dutch Ferguson and 3 neighboring families who'd made the journey to witness. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn from white muslin, with wildflowers in her hair. Jackson wore his new shirt and had trimmed his beard especially for the occasion. When Dutch pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Sarah with all the love and gratitude he felt for this woman who'd walked into his life and changed everything. The small gathering cheered, and they celebrated with a feast Jackson and Sarah had prepared together. To the happy couple, Dutch toasted, raising a glass of whiskey. May your love grow stronger with each passing year, and may you fill these mountains with the sound of children's laughter. That night, alone again in their cabin, Jackson made love to his wife slowly, reverently, his hands gentle on her changing body. I love you, Mrs. Cade, he whispered against her skin. I love you, Mr. Cade. Sarah's fingers traced the scars on his back, each one a story of survival. Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me with your heart. Thank you for seeing something worth saving, for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself. The summer passed in a blur of preparations and joy. Sarah's pregnancy progressed normally, and Jackson marveled at the changes in her body, at the miracle of the life growing inside her. He talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child stories about the mountains, about its mother's bravery, about the world they were preparing to bring it into. In late September, as the aspen leaves turned gold and the first hint of autumn crispness touched the air, Sarah went into labor. Jackson had prepared as best he could, with clean linens and supplies and knowledge gained from a medical book Dutch had found for him. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of watching his wife in pain, unable to do anything but hold her hand and offer words of encouragement. I'm here, he said over and over, wiping sweat from her forehead. You're so strong, Sarah. You can do this. Labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Jackson never left her side, supporting her through each contraction, breathing with her, praying to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago. And finally, as the sun reached its zenith, their son was born. Jackson caught the baby with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the tiny perfect life suddenly present in the world. The baby's cry was strong and healthy, and when Jackson placed him on Sarah's chest, he felt tears stream down his face unchecked. We have a son, Sarah said, her voice exhausted but filled with wonder. Jackson, we have a son. He's perfect. You're perfect. Jackson kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for everything. They named him Daniel, after Jackson's brother, and Michael, after Sarah's father. Daniel Michael Cade entered the world squalling and perfect, with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. Those first weeks were exhausting and beautiful. Jackson had never known he could feel so much love for something so small. He would hold Daniel for hours, just watching him sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. He changed diapers, walked the floor during crying jags, sang lullabies in his rough voice that somehow soothed the baby when nothing else would. Sarah recovered slowly, and Jackson took care of both his wife and son with a tenderness that came naturally now. He cooked meals, cleaned the cabin, did all the chores while Sarah regained her strength. At night, they would lie together with Daniel between them, a family complete. "I never imagined this," Jackson said one evening, watching Sarah nurse their son. "Never let myself hope for something this good." "Neither did I. After Father died, I thought I'd never feel whole again. But now, with you and Daniel, I feel more complete than I ever have." As Daniel grew from a newborn to an infant who smiled and cooed and recognized his parents, Jackson felt the last shadows of his old life fade away. He was no longer the broken soldier hiding in the mountains. He was a husband, a father, a man with purpose and love and a future worth living for. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winters snowed them in, but they were cozy and content in their expanded cabin, with Daniel growing bigger and more curious. Springs brought new life to the mountains and new foals to their growing herd of horses. Summers were for hard work and long days, teaching Daniel as he got older about the land and animals and skills he would need. Autumns were for harvest and preparation, storing food and wood for the coming cold. When Daniel was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because they knew what to expect. In the spring of 1872, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Rose, who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's fierce spirit. Jackson built toys for his children from wood, carved horses and dolls and building blocks. He taught Daniel to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and later taught him to shoot, to track, to read the weather and the land. Sarah taught both children to read and write, creating a small school in one corner of the cabin where they would spend mornings on lessons. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Jackson hired help during the summer months, young men from Fort Benton looking for work, teaching them the skills he'd learned while they helped with the heavier tasks. The horse herd grew, and Jackson gained a reputation for breeding strong, reliable mounts. People traveled from as far as Virginia City to purchase his horses, but despite their success and growing prosperity, Jackson never forgot where he'd come from or how close he'd come to losing everything. Every morning, he would wake early and stand on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and feel grateful for the life he'd been given. Grateful for the woman who'd seen past his walls to the man beneath. Grateful for the children who filled his days with laughter and purpose. Grateful for second chances and new beginnings. One evening, when Daniel was 8 and Emma was 5, the family sat around the dinner table and Daniel asked a question. "Papa, were you always happy?" Jackson exchanged a look with Sarah across the table. They'd decided long ago to be honest with their children about the past, to teach them that life could be hard, but also that it could get better. "No, son, I wasn't. Before I met your mother, I was very sad. I'd lost people I loved, and I thought the sadness would never go away." "What changed?" Daniel's young face was serious. "Your mother came into my life when I needed her most. She reminded me that even when things are darkest, there's still light if you're brave enough to look for it. She taught me that being strong doesn't mean never needing help. It means accepting help when it's offered." "Mama saved you?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. "In every way that matters, yes, she saved me." Jackson reached across the table to take Sarah's hand. "And every day since, she's made my life better just by being in it." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with the same love he felt. "And Papa saved me too, sweetheart. We saved each other. That's what love does." That night, after the children were asleep, Jackson and Sarah stood on the porch under a sky full of stars. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked. "Staying here instead of going to Boston? Living a hard life in the mountains instead of having comfort and society?" "Never. Not once." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "Jackson, you gave me a life of purpose and partnership and love. You gave me beautiful children and a home I helped build. You gave me adventures and challenges and the satisfaction of knowing I'm living on my own terms. How could I regret any of that? I just want you to be happy." "I am happy, deliriously, completely, perfectly happy." She cupped his face in her hands. "You're a good man, Jackson Cade, a good husband, a good father, a good human being. And I thank God every day that I was on that trail when you heard the shots. Thank God you were brave enough to help a stranger. Thank God we found each other." Jackson kissed her under the stars, this woman who'd taught him how to live again, how to love again, how to hope again, She'd walked into his life when he was at his lowest and loved him back to wholeness. She'd seen past the rough exterior to the wounded soul beneath and offered healing instead of judgment. He'd shoed his own horses and mended his own fences for years, believing self-sufficiency was the same as strength. But Sarah had shown him that true strength was vulnerability, was opening your heart even when you were terrified, was letting someone else help carry your burdens. She'd mended the broken parts of him he thought were beyond repair, not by fixing him, but by loving him exactly as he was and believing he could be more. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. More children came, 2 more sons, and the cabin expanded into a proper ranch house with separate bedrooms and a large kitchen. Daniel grew into a young man who loved the mountains as much as his father, who had Jackson's size and strength, but Sarah's gentle spirit. Emma became a teacher like her mother, starting a small school that served the scattered families in the area. Jackson's hair went gray, but his body remained strong from years of hard work. Sarah aged gracefully, laugh lines forming around her eyes from years of joy and laughter. They grew old together in their mountain paradise, surrounded by children and grandchildren, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Sarah riding to the ridge where he'd first seen her, all those years ago when she'd been pressed against an overturned wagon, facing down armed men with nothing but a shaking pistol and fierce courage. "Do you remember that day?" he asked, holding her close as they looked out over the valley below. "I remember thinking I was going to die. And then I remember this huge, terrifying man appearing out of nowhere like an avenging angel." Sarah smiled at the memory. "I had no idea he would become the love of my life. I had no idea that saving a stranger would save me too." Jackson kissed her temple. "You're my miracle, Sarah, my second chance, my everything. And you're mine. 25 years, 5 children, countless adventures, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They stood together on that ridge, 2 souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and built a life of love and purpose. Jackson thought about the man he'd been before Sarah, lonely and broken and convinced he deserved nothing but isolation and pain. And he thought about the man he'd become, a husband, father, grandfather, friend, a man who contributed to his community and found joy in simple things. Sarah had done that, not by changing him, but by loving him enough that he'd been willing to change himself. She'd been patient with his silences, gentle with his wounds, and fierce in her belief that he was worth saving. She'd mended the broken parts of him not with pressure or demands, but with steady, unwavering love that had slowly, carefully brought him back to life. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, Jackson held his wife and felt at peace. He'd shoed his own horses and mended his own fences for years, believing that self-reliance was the only path to safety. But Sarah had taught him that the strongest fences were the ones built together, that the surest foundations were the ones constructed with love and partnership and trust. She'd let him be strong when he needed to be strong, and vulnerable when he needed to be vulnerable. She'd seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. She'd taken a damaged, angry, isolated man and loved him back to wholeness, one day, one moment, one gentle touch at a time. And in return, he'd given her his whole heart, his protection, his devotion, his unwavering commitment to building a life worthy of the gift she'd given him. They'd created something beautiful together in these mountains, not just a ranch or a family, but a love story that would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come. The story of a mountain man who thought he wanted to be alone, and a brave woman who showed him that the greatest strength was opening your heart to love. The story of 2 broken people who found each other in the wilderness and mended each other's wounds with patience and kindness and time. The story of Jackson and Sarah Cade, who proved that even in the hardest, wildest places, love could not only survive but thrive. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they rode back down the mountain toward home, toward the warm glow of lamplight in the windows, toward the sound of their children's voices and the promise of decades yet to come. Jackson looked over at his wife riding beside him, still beautiful, still strong, still the center of his world, and felt grateful beyond words. He'd been so lost before she found him, so convinced that his story was over that the best he could hope for was to survive until death finally claimed him. But Sarah had written a new story with him, a story of redemption and healing and love that conquered even the deepest pain. Jackson Cade had shoed his own horses and mended his own fences for years. But in the end, it was Sarah who'd mended him, who'd taken all his broken pieces and loved them back into something whole and good and worth saving. And for that gift, he would spend the rest of his life grateful, devoted, and deeply, permanently in love. Their ranch would continue for generations, passing from child to child. Each one taught the values Jackson and Sarah had lived by: hard work, integrity, the importance of family, and the transformative power of love. The mountains would witness countless sunrises and sunsets, seasons turning in their eternal rhythm. But the love story that began on a desperate trail in 1868 would remain, a testament to the truth that the bravest thing anyone can do is open their heart to another person and trust them with the broken parts. Jackson and Sarah lived long, full lives, dying within months of each other in their 80s, surrounded by the family they'd created and the love they'd nurtured for over half a century. They were buried side by side on the ridge where they'd first met, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and a single inscription: "Two souls mended by love," and in the cabin that had started as a hermit's refuge and became a family home. Future generations would tell the story of their ancestors, of how a woman's courage and a man's hidden kindness had sparked a love that changed everything. They would speak of Jackson, who'd been strong enough to be vulnerable, and Sarah, who'd been brave enough to love a broken man back to wholeness. The story would be told around fires on cold winter nights, passed down through the decades, evolving but never losing its essential truth: that love is the most powerful force in the world, capable of healing even the deepest wounds, of mending even the most shattered hearts, of transforming isolation into belonging and despair into hope. Jackson Cade had shoed his own horses and mended his own fences, believing self-sufficiency was strength. But it was Sarah Mitchell Cade who'd taught him the greater truth, that letting someone help you, trusting someone with your wounds, opening your heart despite the risk of more pain, that was the real strength. And in learning that lesson, in letting her mend the broken parts of him, he'd found not just survival, but a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a future bright with promise. Their story ended where all the best stories end, with love triumphant, wounds healed, and two hearts finally completely, perfectly whole.